Ministry of Defence is delivering a broadside against Portland which will wipe out the Navy base, the helicopter base, the Defence Research Agency and the Sea Systems Controllerate. Portland without the Navy is almost unthinkable, but now the island must get to grips with the reality. Its importance to the island has dwindled considerably since the golden years between the wars, when Britain maintained a vast surface fleet and Portland was temporary home to thousands of sailors. But even now, when its role is purely sea training for a surface fleet down to fewer than 50 capital ships, the Navy's impact on the area is huge. It's widely accepted that more than 4,000 jobs in the area are related in one way or another to the Navy and the Defence Research Agencies, which have also left the island. Studies for the local authority say 23% of jobs in the area are defence-related. And the Ministry of Defence pours a total of £30 million into the economy of South Dorset through local contractors and the wages of personnel based there. £30 million is an awful lot of money, and it's to save money that sea training is moving. The Ministry of Defence says that putting it into an existing base with spare capacity could save them as much as £5 million a year. Well, that figure is disputed by many people who say that any saving at all is purely an illusion. By the year 2000, the Navy's associations with Portland will be severed. Not only will they have left the port, but all the various defence research establishments will be closed, and the helicopter base will have seen its last training flight. It's an association which goes back certainly 500 years, and probably more. The Navy has always used the natural sheltered anchorage as a haven from the worst of the southwesterly storms.
The close relationship can really be traced back to the time of King Henry VIII. In 1540, the first of the two major naval defence structures were built, and that is Portland Castle and its counterpart on the Weymouth side, Sandsfoot Castle. They were built to defend the roads, that's the anchorage, which we now know as Portland Harbour, against seaborne attack.
The island's relationship with the Navy hasn't always been as amicable as it is now. Portlanders were also known by the nickname of slingers, from their habit of using slings and stones against sailors attempting to land on the island. A boat was the only way to reach the island if you didn't want to walk 8 miles along the pebbles of Chesil Beach. A bridge across the mouth of the fleet is a relatively recent phenomenon. The first was built only 160 years ago. In 1588, Portland played a decisive part in saving the nation from the Spanish Armada. The flagship, San Salvador, was destroyed by a huge explosion just west of the island. 2 days later, the English fleet engaged the Spanish just off Portland Bill, using their superior manoeuvrability and their knowledge of the treacherous Shambles Reef to wreak havoc with the bigger galleons, despite their bigger and more numerous guns. Relationships with the Navy suffered grievously in 1798 when a press gang was challenged by armed Portlanders.
1 or 2 were taken in Underhill, but the Bush Telegraph being what it is, by the time they got to Top Hill, quite a mob had assembled, were quite determined that they wouldn't carry out any further pressings. And the consequence of this was that the mob met them at the top of Reforn. Angry words and shots were exchanged, during which 3 Portlanders fell, one of whom was a young girl called Mary Way, who was only 20 at the time. She lingered on for about another 6 weeks before finally dying of her wounds.
But very soon after, the threat from across the Channel united islanders with the authorities on the mainland. Portland was officially designated a harbour of refuge for the English fleet awaiting a much-feared invasion. And memories of Nelson's heroism against the French were still fresh when the decision to build the Breakwater was made in 1825, though it took several parliamentary debates and a royal commission before work started 22 years later. It was a mammoth undertaking to build breakwaters 1.5 miles long with 6 million tons of rock to enclose the world's biggest man-made harbour.
There was at that time a very severe, very great threat from across the Channel. Obviously France was considered to be the enemy of the country, and just across the water at Cherbourg there was a mighty great breakwater had been formed to form their harbour, and it was reckoned that Portland and this part of the English Channel in particular was very, very vulnerable to attack. There was also the problem that there was no safe anchorage from the elements, from the very severe storms that this part of the Channel can experience, anywhere between Plymouth and the Solent.
When the first two arms of the Breakwater were completed in 1872, the harbour was beginning to assume the shape which has become familiar today. Even before the Breakwater was finished, Portland had started its role as a training establishment. But the arrival of HMS Britannia and its complement of cadets was not entirely a success. They were overcome with seasickness, and the ship was sent on to the calmer waters of Dartmouth, where the naval establishment still bears the Britannia name. It wasn't long, though, before HMS Boscawen arrived to become a familiar sight in the harbour for many decades to come, and to give its name to the shore establishment. Portland provided initial training for boys and a specialist gunnery school. Royalty were regular visitors to the Navy and to the Royal Manor of Portland. Victoria and Albert were present for the start and finish of the Breakwater. Great occasions attended by thousands who could at least see the royal yacht, if not the royal couple themselves. In 1910, HMS Dreadnought, the greatest battleship Britain had ever seen, was honoured to receive a visit from the Emperor and Princess of Abyssinia. It was only some months later the hoax was revealed. It was a group of undergraduates from Cambridge, including the young novelist Virginia Woolf, in fancy dress. They hadn't been tumbled even though one of their cousins was a young officer on board. And in 1932, George V came to Portland aboard the Royal Yacht for a review of the fleet, captured on an early amateur movie camera by a local Portland man who worked in the dockyard. The Dorset base was then in its heyday, home to dozens of ships, a refuge for scores more as they were mothballed after the war. The First World War had seen Portland playing its part in defending the Channel, particularly against the German U-boats, against which there was little defence at the time. Some of our own submarines and a whole flotilla of anti-submarine vessels were based at Portland. Some of the most famous names in naval history became famous again in their new incarnations as the battleships HMS Rodney and Nelson, which were both familiar sights in the harbour. The redundant battleship HMS Hood was deliberately scuttled across the most southerly entrance to the harbour at the outbreak of war in 1914. The idea was to prevent submarines or torpedoes destroying the fleet at anchor. It's still there to this day. There were worries about Portland's vulnerability to air attack at the start of the Second World War, and not without reason. The converted merchant ship Foylebank was bombed in the harbour. Leading seaman Jack Mantle stayed at his guns despite mortal wounds, to become the only man to win the VC in home waters. And in 1944, Portland became one of the most important embarkation points for the D-Day landings, as 500,000 American troops poured through South Dorset to take part in the liberation of Europe.
Undoubtedly, that was the climax by any standards of the use of this port, the naval port of Portland, with Weymouth. And yes, thousands upon thousands of troops and their vehicles passed through this port for the same reason that the place was built in the 19th century. It was a very convenient and useful setting off point and anchorage for that purpose.
Shortly before Portland's Breakwater was finished, there was a new development in naval warfare which was to affect the area profoundly. It was the invention of the torpedo. In 1891, Robert Whitehead and the Vickers Engineering Company opened the world's first torpedo factory at Wyke Regis, and the area has been one of the world's centres for experiments in underwater warfare ever since, with research establishments on the island and across Portland Harbour. Mines and depth charges have been developed here, along with countermeasures such as hydrophones, ASDIC and sonar. And as the Navy is departing, so are the research establishments, leaving the island no legacy of its scientific past, save a few empty buildings. Some of the attention this work attracted was most unwelcome. 2 Russian spies landed at this cove at the height of the Cold War. One of the clerks at the naval base was spying for Russia. He was taking documents and photographing top-secret plans. One night, he sat up here with a torch, signalling to bring ashore 2 Soviet agents who'd landed from a submarine. What became of them, no one knows. But Harry Houghton, his girlfriend Ethel G., the spymaster Gordon Lonsdale and the Krugers were caught and jailed. They were together known as the Portland Spy Ring. But such incidents are minor blemishes on Portland's record as an outstanding centre for sea training, the role it has made its own for nearly 4 decades. Ships come for a punishing 6-week workup, at the end of which they should be ready for the worst that war or peacetime emergency can throw at them.
The fire aft in Sierra section is top priority for the fight situation of the ship. Action.
Brace! 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 Get up, Joe!
HMS Invincible was put through the ringer in an accelerated 3-week workup. It was wanted in the Adriatic to relieve its sister ship Illustrious as tension mounted in Bosnia. In the final days of a ship's workup at Portland, the captain and crew are given no respite. Every eventuality is thrown at them in an unrelenting stream. It's geared so that the commanding officer gets a maximum of 6 hours sleep each day. And day after day, the problems pile one on another.
You should better get to bridge control.
Then, stretched to breaking point, they're sent to war.
Increase max already, coming right to 0.
In the infamous Thursday War, every aspect of the crew's performance is put to the test.
It's exciting, I think, to say the least. It's very tiring. It's very hard course to undergo because every attempt is made to make things very realistic indeed. And it's rather like the sort of peak periods of warfare has been described of lots of boredom and minutes of excitement. Well, I think that there was no time to get bored at Portland ever, and it was 6 weeks of excitement. So you really were under tremendous pressure, but it was very rewarding in the end and very beneficial, I think, to the ships.
Admiral Pritchard went through Portland several times as junior officer and commanding his own ships, before he became responsible for it all as the flag officer's sea training.
It was undoubtedly the finest maritime training school in the world. There's just no question about that. I mean, even the Americans were prepared to admit that. We had an American ship come through during my time there, and I think they were very, very impressed. Different way of doing things. This constant pressure is something which the other marine training organisations don't necessarily follow. But I think it's paid off. I mean, the fact that our ships did so well in the Falklands, and more importantly, that our people in the ships were more confident of their capability in the Falklands, is largely due to what happened at Portland.
Ships can start exercising even before they leave the harbour at Portland, a great advantage considering the cost of running a modern warship. And once the exercise starts, that pace is frenetic. The airborne early warning equipment on the Sea Kings provides an eye in the sky, radars that can watch for approaching trouble over the horizon. And hardly are they off the deck before Invincible is under attack. The Harriers are launched to intercept incoming Hawks.
Starboard 10.
Starboard 10.
Roger, coming right. Leading head to port.
Guns, missiles, and the goalkeeper radar-guided cannons are brought to bear on the attackers.
DC Visual, Port Lands holds aircraft at Raider 20, range 5 miles. Starboard Lands lost aircraft behind the bill.
Roger, Rob.
The crew have to be ready for the worst. Priorities have to be decided to keep the ship afloat and keep it fighting.
This is damage at HQ1. Change to priorities on the fire. The fire in 6 Foxtrot 4 is no longer the priority. The priority fire is the fire in 6 Sierra section. I say again, the priority fire is in 6 Sierra section. That's all.
Person of fire is there. It's in the woodwork shop. There's casualties up there. You got hoses already up there.
We can't go in because the door's shut.
Casualties inside the woodwork shop, see?
I don't know.
All the time, there are assessors from the team at Portland looking over their shoulder. There are nearly 100 of them on board, checking if the right decisions are being made, whether instructions are being carried out effectively, and whether people have learned their drills.
Get back to Q and on this bulkhead?
110.
7 miles.
How long will it take to get here?
300 knots.
Yep. What's that roughly? Miles a minute.
Oh, you're looking at
300 knots, Mac. 5 miles there. 7. All right. 7 miles a minute. 7 miles a minute. 10 miles. It's going to be 1.5 minutes.
Invincible is a busy airfield as well as a complicated ship. It has to fight as well as defend itself. And there are 101 things happening at any one time in various parts of the ship.
Emergency required on the J2 diesel. J2 diesel, start. Local start. Foreign engine, SCC.
The inspection team says there's bomb damage and diesel fuel is pouring into the workshops. It's one of 6 incidents around the ship, and more are coming in by the minute.
Yeah, this is HQ1. Fire in the LOX plant. Fire in the LOX plant. Touch drills only operate the LOX plant sprays. Operate the LOX plant sprays.
Right, that's all done.
Wait that. Fire in the LOX plant.
Fire is in the LOX machinery compartment above, not the LOX plant.
Roger that.
Relay your lab.
Here, this is HQ1. Belay the last pipe. Belay the last pipe. The fire is in the LOX machinery compartment above the LOX plant. That's all.
In the fog of war, information isn't always accurate. It all adds to the pressure. Invincible is relying on its anti-submarine Sea Kings and other ships in the fleet with sophisticated sonars to keep it safe from underwater attack. In control rooms on all the ships, eyes will be riveted to sonar and radar screens, just as they are aboard an enemy submarine, supplied by our Dutch NATO allies to add extra realism to the event.
Peiling is dit. 351. Neer. Kom uit bij de voetbal komen.
Coming to periscope depth reveals one of the Sea Kings has done its job of detecting the enemy.
You saw a helicopter coming in. They're 2 frigates with very good sonars. You don't want to be on the receiving side of these weapons. So what we will do is take a fix and then go deep and try to evade.
But air attacks and missiles have done their worst on the surface, and on the aircraft carrier there are simulated casualties to be tended. Even the first aid is under scrutiny by the sea training team. Many crews taking part in the Thursday War will also be veterans of a Portland Distex, or disaster exercise. Royal Navy vessels are probably more likely to get embroiled in civil emergencies than in open warfare, so they get rehearsed in dealing with the after effects of earthquake and eruption. For this exercise, the Dorset outpost becomes a Caribbean island struck by hurricane and an attempted armed coup. There are British subjects to be rescued, rioting islanders to be dealt with, and more casualties to be treated. If the whole idea is to push men to their very limits, then there will be occasions when they get pushed beyond them, and accidents do happen. Within the past year, there have been several incidents. In February, there was a collision involving a German submarine. It was damaged when it came into contact with the frigate HMS Battleaxe. Just 3 weeks later, the Portuguese submarine Barracuda limped into port, more seriously damaged after an almost identical accident. A sailor went berserk in May on board the German destroyer Mulders. He seized control of a small boat after throwing a colleague overboard during joint naval exercises off Portland. And in June, a Turkish frigate Barbaros nearly hit one of the Portland tugs with a 5-inch practice shell when it should have been aiming at the target it was towing. But lest we get smug, our own Navy scared the living daylights out of a group of Weymouth fishermen when it planted a 4.5-inch shell in between their boats about 3 years ago. The ship's time at Portland is an almost non-stop whirl of activity, and the fact the base is used purely for sea training means the crews are away from the distractions of home and loved ones for the duration, just one of its advantages.
The range of facilities that we have here is pretty much what you would want if you designed a sea training base from scratch, because of course at Portland I don't have very much competition. No ships are based here, and I have the full use of the harbour and the areas.
The Ministry of Defence's main reason for moving sea training from Portland is cost. They say it will be much cheaper to operate from the spare capacity at an existing naval base such as Devonport, rather than maintain an entirely separate facility.
Of course the Treasury has a part in it, and you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that the defence budget is declining these days, and we've had to look very hard at the business of frontline costs and support costs and trim back as far as we can on support to ensure that we've got the forces that the country expects of us in the front line. And part of trimming back on support is looking at whether we need the number of naval bases we have and whether we can do the same job elsewhere. And frankly, that's the decision. As far as Portland is concerned, we can shoehorn sea training into Plymouth and do it from there.
And since the advent of jet aircraft, nuclear submarines, long-range missiles and electronic warfare, there have been strong operational reasons for moving elsewhere. It was suggested 25 years ago.
The problem that we had to face was faster submarines, bigger submarines, faster aeroplanes, longer range missiles, enormous improvements in technology. And all of this required us to operate at the highest pitch in uncluttered airspace, deeper water and uncluttered sea areas. And gradually Portland was being forced out of that upper level of training because of the relative shallow water of the channel and the cluttered airspace. But that left about 80% of the total training to be done at Portland, where it continued to be done in a very successful way.
But there are drawbacks to the move to Devonport and working from an operational Navy base.
It's a busy dockyard port, it's a busy commercial port, and I'm sensitive to the fact that I will not be necessarily the highest priority user of those. We need to work alongside the people there, and that, I think, is one of the challenges that we all face. Sea training is going to move to Plymouth, and it's going to work because we need it to work, and we want to produce training to the same high standards as we do here.
But if the main reason is money, then there are those who say it's a very misguided move.
The figures which were provided at the time were well, farcical. I mean, for example, they were budgetary figures, not based on any firm estimates at all. At the time of the consultation period, the firm plans as to how FOST would be set up at Plymouth had not been completed, and so it was impossible for MOD to put clear figures on it.
Will there be any savings?
I personally don't believe so. I mean, even within the figures which were provided at the time of the consultation, it was shown that it would be marginally cheaper to remain here. And in fact, if some of the changes to training were implemented here, which are being enforced at Plymouth, then quite considerable operational savings could have been achieved. In other words, there would be more ship availability for operations abroad.
But such arguments put forward by the unions, local authorities and supporters of Portland didn't impress the Ministry of Defence or the Treasury. Neither did claims that any savings there might be for the defence budget would be more than offset by the costs of higher unemployment, reduced tax revenue and regenerating the economy of South Dorset. So the Navy is leaving Portland, and with it goes a huge chunk of the island's heritage. In the short term, it may be the jobs and the money that matter, but in the future, what will replace the part the Navy has played in forming the island's character and giving it a sense of pride in knowing that it's serving the nation?
There has always been a great pride, I think, for the Royal Navy by what is a maritime community.
If you ask the sailors about Portland, it's an awful place where it blows all the time and the weather is terrible the whole time. But I think those who've actually served there, as opposed to, you know, passed through it, have found it quite different. The climate is not as bad as people say. My wife and I certainly enjoyed living there. But I think more importantly, the people of Portland, they're a funny bunch in many ways, but they are people who welcome you. And certainly I've got a great affection for the Isle of Portland and the people who live there.
There are a great number of memories, and the name Portland has been synonymous with sea training for years, of course, not just in the Royal Navy, but in a number of European and other countries as well.
Work has already begun to turn Portland Harbour into a commercial port. There is widespread optimism that the project will prove successful and will provide new jobs and money for the area. But even the most optimistic accept that it will be many years before it can even start to fill the huge gap left by the departure of every facet of Portland's contribution to Britain's defence.
Further aid possible to the west, caused by QECM.
These two tracking aircraft bearing at red 50, tracking right to left.
Ops, bridge, acknowledge. I haven't heard him come out with a business.
Bridge, acknowledge. Negative, keys in both, give me sector 2 to launch jets. That's the ones who'll be recovering at minute 1.
The last in this series, special report returns in September.
Straight into flight 2B.